Well, hello everyone, and first of all, hello, dear students from St. John Bosco College in PR Waters, Australia. Thank you so much for submitting your questions, and I decided I'm gonna post it as the regular video on my YouTube channel. Once again, my name is Sergey Sputnikov, and my channel is Ushanka Show, where I share my stories about experience of living in the Soviet Union. So for those who don't know, probably the most of my viewers, one of my subscribers, John from Australia, he works as a teacher in St. John Bosco College, and we were talking back and forth for a while about helping them with the topic of Soviet Union during their history lessons. And in the end, they submitted several questions. They voted for them, picked the best questions from the class. So today I'm going to answer those questions, and they're good questions. So I decided, okay, might as well, we'll put it together posted as a video. So this is once again for my friends in PR Waters, Australia. How cool is that? So anyways, we'll go right away to your questions. Our first question was from Massimo. What were the main differences that you noticed in the way people lived between before and after Soviet Union fell? Just a quick reminder, I was born in 1971. So in 1991, when Soviet Union was dissolved, I was 20, so I was old enough to remember changes. What I remember, well, first of all, I just want to give you this basic example that I came up with. You all probably went to a swimming pool one time or several times, and I'm not sure, because in Australia, I was picturing you guys live on the bottom. You probably can't have pools because water will be falling out. Just kidding. So anyways, so you probably noticed every swimming pool has like kiddie area, right? We call it in Russian legushatnik for the little frogs. So that's a shallow area, right? Only for little kids. So imagine, in my imagination, my idea is the Soviet Union was like a shallow swimming pool with extremely strict lifeguards. So there was extremely strict rules, and anyone who breaks those rules get punished quite severely. Like, for example, it was illegal not to work. It was illegal to be unemployed. So if you couldn't find work on your own and you don't have a valid excuse, they could put you in prison. It was illegal to be homeless. So once again, if you can't find your housing options, they can put you in prison. But it was safe because pool was shallow. So it would be hard to drown. It's just shallow. So we were equal, but we were all pretty much equally poor. But because housing was so cheap, some basic food staples were cheap, no one was really starving, at least, in the 70s, 80s, some 60s. Stalin era is a different story. So that was kind of, really safe but extremely boring swimming pool lifestyle. And it had extremely strict lifeguards, KGB, or watching the show, and suddenly lifeguards disappeared and bottom of the pool fell out, so now you have to swim. So a lot of people, let's say, they didn't know how to swim. For generations, anyone who was entrepreneurship type and tried to make extra money, police was after them, KGB was after them, because it was illegal to buy goods here and resell them here for profit. It was called speculation. You go to prison. If you do it in large scale, it could go as bad for you as being executed. So there were some people that it was natural for them to start swimming. So they became businessmen. They started opening businesses, selling, buying stuff, going to other countries, bringing goods back. So there was I don't know what percentage, but quite a few people did actually quite well. And a lot of people were lost, like little puppies, young puppies, because they didn't know what to do. They grew up, given this specific job, and you go there, you work, get paid a little bit, but it's enough to pay your housing, have your basic needs covered. Sure, most people couldn't afford a car. They didn't have fancy vacations, couldn't own second homes, but on the basic level was safe. So a lot of people lost puppies. Unfortunately, my father was kind of like that. He continued to go into the same place of work even they stopped paying. Or paid with gaps in 6 months. Although he was a good spray painter who could open his little business, paint cars, he didn't want to do anything of that. So of course behavior changed. Suddenly there's the people who were becoming rich and the people who become even more poor. So what I noticed, people who did well at that time, there was like you have to have a leather jacket. So you would see the family goes, wife has leather jacket, husband wears leather jacket, they're doing well. Then there was another bizarre thing came up. Then they started buying cars. In the Soviet Union, there was like one car per 30 families, so cars were extremely expensive, hard to get. You had to wait up to 9 years being on the waiting list to buy a car. And imagine if you make $150 a month and a car is $7,000-8,000, it's a lot of money. But now, since we could import used cars from Germany, from the West, people started buying used BMWs, Mercedeses. So those people started having cars. So cars, leather jackets. And then another thing was interesting, there was like a new trend to have a dog. And they're always not like cute little dogs. They wanted killer dogs, scary dogs. One of the reasons, because now their apartments have nice stuff. So they were afraid that people will break in and steal. So you could see, there'll be a family all wearing leather jackets, and they have like a dogs like pit bulls or bull terriers, just scary dogs that just want to tear you up. So that was kind of this image of the new successful people, and they actually got a nickname, Novaya Ruskia, that's for Russia, New Russians. And of course in Ukraine, we had New Ukrainians, that's those people that did well, got rich or extremely rich if they had connections to the new governments. And of course, then behavior changed too. Like they started having this attitude like, I'm so cool and you trash. So that was what I remember. And of course, since people started having more dogs, we started having an issue with dog crap on the loans because there was no culture of picking up after your dogs. So this is kind of like big picture, what changed in behaviors. So there were quite a few people who did well. They figure out how to do something. Usually it was buy, sell, resellers, get wholesale something, then resell. And I had to still go to college, so of course I couldn't take advantage of opportunities. And sometimes I'm telling people I couldn't be successful back then because I was too honest. There's actually another thing I noticed. Like my generation, a lot of kids that were doing not really well in school. So like the ones that did really poorly, they just kind of couldn't deal a lot of times. They either went into drinking or sometimes they joined like gangs of racketeers. But some guys were in the middle, they had like, I don't know, if you in Australia also, ABC type of grades. So C students, so they were already kind of like trying to game system in school, so they had no problem breaking laws, and they were the most successful because a lot of these new businesses were kind of shady. Not really legal because laws were not changing yet fast enough. So the people who didn't have a problem to break the laws, kind of ignored the laws, they did it better than honest people who tried to like honestly open business, register it, pay taxes. They struggled. So this is what I remember, what changes were between people lived before and after Soviet Union collapse. Great question, Massimo. All right, so next question from Jacob. Did you notice any major differences in the way Ukrainians and Russians were treated in the Soviet Union? If so, what difference did you see? Not really. I actually have a big video on this topic. It's all about what I remember of relations between Russians and Ukrainians. But once again, I didn't travel in Soviet Union much, unfortunately. I was too young to care, so I didn't visit many places. So I lived in Kyiv, capital of Ukraine. And at that time, capital of Ukraine was pretty much Russian speaking. So it's a separate topic how Kremlin, Soviet government was pushing agenda of making everyone speak Russian in a country like you just speak Russian. They were, if you're Ukrainian, your first language should be Russian still, and then you can speak some Ukrainian. So that was policy they tried to make, like, we're not going to have Russians or Ukrainians, we're going to have Soviet nation, like Soviet people, and their language will be Russian language. About half of my friends were Russians, and we all spoke Russian. They could skip lessons of Ukrainian language in schools, and by the way, schools were Russian-speaking schools. So I lived in the capital of Ukraine, and there was hardly any schools that taught in Ukrainian language. So math, everything, subjects were taught in Russian. And I had lessons of Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian language. So even if I'm Ukrainian by nationality, my first language was always Russian. Like I speak way better Russian than Ukrainian. And when my parents came from the villages into Kiev, they had to switch to Russian language because that was the language that everyone communicated. So kind of bizarre. So at that time, of course, I didn't notice much difference. It was kind of the same because I spoke Russian. We had kind of our Ukrainian accent, but there was no real, I didn't feel like people were treated better or worse because they were Ukrainians or Russians. The only, like, can say real Ukrainians remain in the Western Ukraine, and we call them, Westerners, Zapadenцы, and they were pretty strict about speaking Ukrainian, not Russian. So they kept Ukrainian as the first language, and they had a little accent, so you could always recognize who is from the Western Ukraine. But as I said, generally, because of the policy of Russification, I grew up pretty much as a Russian, but I never consider myself, you see, there's another thing you need to think. I always consider myself Soviet. I was Soviet and of Ukrainian nationality. And my friends were, also Soviet, but of Russian nationality. So when we watched the hockey games in the 80s, it's always made me mad when Western commentators will say, "Oh, Russian team." I'm like, that's not Russian team, it's Soviet team. But in the West, Russian and Soviet was always like an interchangeable term. But for me, it was, no, we are Soviets, and you cannot call hockey team or soccer team Russian. So I didn't notice, I said, it's just because it was pretty much Kiev was Russian town, Russian-speaking town. I didn't see any difference. And now, like a lot of Russians who miss Soviet Union, they complain that one of the problem is because a lot of Ukrainians were in the government. Like they claim that Brezhnev was Ukrainian, Khrushchev was Ukrainian. So real Russians were never in the government, like at the top. So that's why Soviet Union collapsed, but I don't buy that. So anyway, great question. We'll go to the next one soon. All right, so next question from Satvir. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. When you were living in the Soviet Union, did people talk about the KGB, or did people deliberately not talk about them? Well, once again, I was growing up 70s, 80s, and my family was kind of apolitical, so we didn't talk about politics at all. My parents just were busy, surviving as a trying to get a better housing conditions, because for 5 years, my family had to share a small room with another family. We lived in the family dormitories, so that was horrible. But I was too young to remember at that time. Then we lived in a little tiny room for another 5 years, and only after that, my parents managed to get a nicer 3-room apartment. So we never talked about politics, and in the 80s. It wasn't as scary like during Stalin era now. In NKVD, 1930s, 1937, 38, they terrorized the entire country. People were arrested in the middle of the night, sentenced to 10 years, 25 years in the labor camps. So after the death of Stalin, it was kind of not as scary, let's put it that way. So KGB was still watching, but it wasn't like, everywhere you go, you're afraid of KGB, you're afraid to say anything. Like in the early 80s, was not really scary to joke about Leonid Brezhnev, about his eyebrows or how he slurs, can't speak properly. So there was nothing I would say was like fear. So we didn't talk about KGB because we really didn't care about it. Although, KGB also knew what type of people cause troubles. So they were watching more like, writers, journalists, scientists, because that's the people that usually were not happy with the Soviet system and they had resistance. So that's the people who got in trouble. But in the 70s, I think starting from 60s, they changed the strategy. Instead of sending people to prisons or labor camps, they were just decided, okay, you're crazy. If you don't like Soviet Union and if you don't like Soviet system, you're crazy. crazy people go to crazy houses. So, they started sending people who resist the system to hospitals for mentally disabled people, and they will inject them with all kind of drugs. So that's what a lot of people went through, that nightmare. And it's hard to say what's worse, to be in prison or being in share rooms with mentally disabled people, and they inject you all those type of drugs. So there was quite a bit of torture that way. There's a books, one of the guy, I think his last name Bukovsky, he ended up being exchanged for the leader of Communist Party of Chile in the 70s, and he wrote a book about his experience going through all this treatment as a crazy person. So yeah, I really grew up not being afraid of KGB. We didn't think about it. The only time they'll mention KGB if there'll be some other foreign spy arrested in Moscow. Of course, we had movies about our KGB fighting CIA, stuff like that. So yeah, during my time, we weren't afraid of KGB. There were jokes about it, sure, but yeah, so that was not too bad. Good question, though. All right, next question from Alexander. By the way, my daughter's name is Alexandra, because we have Alexandra in Russian. When you were in school in the Soviet Union, what sort of facts or information did they teach you about other countries? So the only time we touched other countries would be lessons of history or geography. So we didn't really study other countries at all. It was mostly concentrated everything around Soviet Union, maybe before Soviet Union, Russian history. But there was, history of the ancient world. So of course you have to talk about Rome, ancient Greece. And then of course World War II. Then you have some mention about Germany, United States. But otherwise, we didn't study a lot about other countries. That was more part of the propaganda in the newspapers and magazines. They'll tell us how horrible life in the United States and how great life in the Soviet Union. So yeah, for a long time, I even had this strange idea that the capital of the United States is New York, because usually in Europe, in the Soviet Union, the largest city is the capital. So I knew the largest city in the United States is New York, so it's the capital. So kind of was caught off guard to find out that actually the capital of New York is not New York. Capital of the United States is not New York, but Washington, D.C. Then, capital of Michigan, where I live now, is not Detroit, the largest city, but way smaller city of Lansing. So that was kind of... So yeah, we didn't learn much about other countries. Nothing I recall in specific, but so there'll be geography, and I love geography. But when we studied geography, it would be mostly about, generally capitals of the countries and tallest mountains, largest oceans, largest seas. So geographical, not really when it comes to countries. So that's what I remember. All right, moving along. Next question from Lyanna. What sort of things did teenager and young people do for fun relaxation when you were in the Soviet Union? All kinds, of course. I mean, entertainment was limited. And that's, I guess now when I'm adult, I'm thinking it's a good thing. So because usually you had to work, adults, they had to work. So during the day, both parents will be at work. I live in a city, so everyone lives in apartment buildings. There's hardly any people in the cities have their own house. So we come home from school, there's expression, I don't know if you guys have it in Australia, latch key kid. So on the rope on my neck will be a key to my apartment. I open the door, have lunch, and I was one of those nerds that couldn't play outside until my homework is done because they'll be just bothering me. So I'll do quickly homework, then I go outside and play with my friends. So that's kind of how I went to school for 10 years. You live in the morning, your mom, have breakfast, say goodbye to your parents, then they leave for work. Well, my dad will leave in early. He was going early to work, then I leave for school, then my mom left for work, and then I come back around 5, 6 p.m. So kids will be playing on their own, being on their own from 2 p.m. till 5, 6 p.m. And you think, yeah, it'll be awesome. You can just turn the TV on and watch cartoons. There was nothing to watch on TV for kids, even for adults. I even didn't bother to turn TV because there'll be some opera or ballet. So there was nothing for kids to watch. So it forced us to go outside and play. So I think it's a good thing, of course, as adult, because otherwise, I have no doubt I'll be sitting, parents are gone, I can just watch cartoons. So that was kind of good. So we played outside, different games, nothing wild. And of course, as kids grew up, then you maybe have a girl that you like or a boy, so they, walk together to the park, hang out. Some older kids, will get into smoking and drinking. So there'll be some areas they'll sit on the bench and play guitar. So once again, options to entertain was limited. No teenagers can own the car. That was unheard of. So it's, the whole car culture that probably Australia has as the United States. We don't have that at all. It's all, if it's a rainy day, then you just go one of the apartment buildings and you stay there on the staircase and you hang out. My parents were very kind. They let my friends to come because when we had 3 rooms, I had my own room. So I have friends to come in and we'll listen to music, we'll play chess. So I was always a nerd. So I like reading books, so for entertainment, we'll play chess, play cards, listen to music. So nothing really, maybe go to the movies, but that was just for the weekend. And also teenagers in Soviet Union, we really didn't have any options to make money, like, work part-time somewhere on the weekend at McDonald's or doing some other chores that people pay you. It's a city. So we didn't have pocket cash really, and you have to beg your parents for it. So there was nothing really unusual, but some kids, they would go through schools, they'll have some pochody, so like tourists, they will take a train, leave the city, and they'll hike in the woods, and they set up camp, just hang out that way. So nothing really unusual I can think of, but definitely was way less entertainment. We didn't have many concerts to go to. In all my life, I went to a concert only once while I was there, and I was already, I think, right towards the end of the Soviet Union, maybe 1990. That's when the concerts became like a big thing, and I went to one rock band. It was kind of cool. So the options for entertainment were limited. So people, teenagers, young people had to entertain themselves. So in the restaurants, of course, were expensive, hard to get to. So the option just take your girlfriend to the restaurant was not an option. So if you have a girlfriend, boyfriend, your options will be walk in the park, maybe take them to the movies, take them to a cafeteria to have ice cream. So everything was pretty basic. As I said, we were equally poor people. But good question. All right, and the last question from Ava. When you were at school, how did they teach you about the Russian Revolution? Did they focus on the heroic actions of the leaders or on something else? And there's another question, I'll read it separately. I think it's also from Ava. So my question is, what a revolution? So we had, in 1917, we had 2 revolutions. One was in February, and that's called Russian Revolution, or February Revolution. That's when Tsar, Russian king, was deposed, and we had some kind of like a democratic government, they called temporary government. Then, so that's February 1917. Then in October of 1917, that's what there was, which originally was called October Coup. Later, the Soviet government changed the name to Great October Revolution. So that's when Bolsheviks took over. And that's when we went towards socialist society. So of course, the language was changing. So you're probably asking about Russian Revolution as the October Revolution. Unfortunately, there was a lot of not true statements, we'll put it that way, because the original was the coup, was nothing really revolution. It was just in the middle of the night, a group of Bolsheviks with some soldier sympathizers took over the government in St. Petersburg. At that time it was called Petrograd. So there was a coup. It was not like mass uprising everywhere. In fact, I think it was July, they had elections and Bolsheviks didn't do really well. They lost. But then later on, the language was changed and it became from October Coup to the Great October Revolution. And there was a lot of, the way the revolution, the coup occurred, kind of interesting, when the main leaders were out of town. The temporary government, Временное правительство, they made Bolshevik Party illegal, I believe. So they were going to arrest Lenin, Stalin, and other Bolshevik leaders. So they had to escape Petrograd, the capital, and hide. So when they went into hiding, so the guy who remained in Petrograd was Leon Trotsky. I don't know if you guys know that name. Later, his name was completely erased from the Soviet history, like totally erased. You never mention a word of Trotsky in any history books. He was the worst guy ever, but he actually was the guy who organized the October coup, was talking to soldiers, had meetings, and convinced them to help to overthrow the temporary government. So he was like the leader of October coup, and later, of course, his trace was erased. And after it was successful, then Lenin came back, and he had this famous speech standing on the top of the armored carrier. So that's kind of became this theme. So they kind of like, yeah, the October Revolution happened, and then Lenin came to. So there was like, I feel bad now, like as a kid, I never bothered to think in school, like, wait a minute. So how did revolution occur when Lenin was not there? Like, who ran it? You know, Stalin wasn't there. And, you know, and then for a while, of course, so now the whole focus, of course, on Lenin. Lenin, you know, that's kind of how became Soviet Jesus. Trotsky disappeared, and Stalin was, for a while, you know, there was Lenin and Stalin. Then after Stalin died and Nikita Khrushchev became the leaders, they started removing mention of Stalin out of history books. So yeah, I was kind of learning the latest version of what happened. You know, they constantly rewrite history. So it's kind of like, I thought Lenin was there, but I know he wasn't, because that event when he came back on a train from Finland from hiding and had his fiery speech on the armored carrier Bronevik, that's what I remember. So the focus pretty much became like Lenin was, you know, that was driving force. He was pretty much the only guy who kind of was running the show, and was not mentioning of Trotsky for a long time. And then, of course, Stalin fell off too. So this is what I remember. In general, as I said, they made it sound like it was a huge deal, you know, great October Revolution, although in fact it was just a midnight coup when a bunch of armed people ran into the main, like a White House, Winter Palace, and they took over. But good question. All right, and the last question, I think it's also from Ava. James didn't write, whose name was, did people born in the cities get better treatment, more opportunities when compared to people on the farms and in remote regions? This is actually a great question, and I'm planning to start turning topics on my channel to the folks out in the countries, because people out in the villages and the countries, they really got, you know, that expression, the short end of the stick. Because in the beginning, when the October Revolution happened, the Bolsheviks had several really important slogans, and that's what a lot of people kind of like them. They said soldiers should get peace. So, you know, we're going to pull out of World War I. We don't want our soldiers to die. So peace for soldiers. Then they said workers should get factories, fabriki, to the factory. So now you're a worker, you become owner of your own factory. So that was another slogan. Then all the people, хлеб народу, so bread should be given to people, and земля крестьянам, so the peasants should get land. So that was, of course, a lot of people like, yeah, because we had society where out in the country was the landlords, and they owned pretty much all the land. Peasants had tiny lots or none, so had to work for landlords. And suddenly with these Bolsheviks come like, hey, we're going to kick out all the landlords and you can have land. So that was originally sound like a great idea for a lot of people, but it turned out that Bolsheviks changed their mind at some period of time. So then in 1929, 30, 31, they started collectivization. So that's Stalin era. And they basically forced all the peasants to work at the collective farms. You know, they let you have a little plot to grow crops to feed yourself. Otherwise, you're required to work for the collective farm. You bring your animals and you go there and work. And, you know, if the collective farm makes some profit, they're technically supposed to pay you. In reality, it was hardly any pay, but you were required by law to work there. So it was pretty much almost like slavery. So villages in the Soviet Union were extremely poor. Cities were developing, but it was the villages that took the brunt of pretty much the money. Crops were sucked out of the villages. And of course, if you work for free, you don't work really effectively, let's put it that way. You're not really productive because, you work hard, you don't get paid much, or you don't work hard, or you don't work at all, you still get the same pay. So of course, we always had shortage of food. Villagers were surviving on their little plots, огороды, like my grandparents. And it was, I went to stay with my grandparents every summer when I was a kid, when I was a student. So during the summer break, my parents will send me to the village. It was literally like returning to the last 100 years back. Like in the village, was no one had a running water in the house or indoor plumbing. So everyone had outhouse. So, we're talking 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. People still had to use outhouses. If you need water, you go to the well and you get water out of the well. I have videos on that topic. Then, you have your own cows, you have your own milk. So basically you live like Amish. I don't think you have in Australia Amish people. So that's this religious group. There's some in Indiana and Pennsylvania. They refuse modern conveniences like electricity, telephone, cars. So they still use horses, and they kind of live that way, old-fashioned style. So Soviet villagers were like Amish, but they could use electricity. So my grandparents had no TV, even no refrigerator. The only modern convenience is they had a radio and electricity in their log cabin. They had to heat a log cabin with firewood. So all summer would be spent chopping firewood. So definitely that was kind of big kind of thing about Soviet Union. If you go to the villages, it was horrifying because they were so behind. In many cases, like they still used horses way into 80s and 90s even. Soviet Union was manufacturing like 200,000 horse wagons and horse buggies in the 80s. So the horses were still used a lot out in the country. It's kind of bizarre. No one was using horses. Horses became like entertainment in other countries, but they were used as a workhorse. Like every time we needed to plow the field in the spring, my grandfather, who was born in 1907 and he passed away in 1983, he had to go to collective farm and borrow a horse and a plow to plow his field. Then he had to borrow a horse to bring firewood out of forest. They had a bicycle, and later he bought a little moped. So they were extremely poor, pretty much living off land. Then when they retired, their pensions were so small. My grandmother had pension only 12 rubles a month, which is not much at all. So yeah, that's what was the problem. Soviet Union was a powerful country. Picture a bodybuilder, a guy who does only biceps but skipped leg days, so his legs are tiny. So our agriculture was so weak, people were so poor, so we had to buy grain from other countries like Canada, United States, and Australia. You guys used to sell a lot of grain, wheat, to Soviet Union. But we had a huge military, we had huge space industry, but then people still use horses to plow fields and used outhouses because they didn't have indoor plumbing. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoy my answers. I hope you learned something new. James can maybe show you some more. I have the specific videos on the covering the topics. There's one I covered everything about Russia and Ukraine, what I remember. So anyway, thanks again for reaching out and submitting your questions. It was fun. We'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.